So we have our first lesson. Using SVG, but I want to give kind of like a really quick overview of these two technologies and why you might choose one over the other. And so with SVG, or Scalar Vector Graphics, it is an XML syntax. So it's kind of, you work with it very similarly to how you might already be working in HTML. So each there's like really subtle differences in syntax, and like sometimes it's like the subtle differences always gets me. So then I get like tiny bugs when I like go from SVG to HTML, because like the attribute is called the same thing, but then like the syntax is slightly different. So just watch out for those, and like, you know, pay attention to the SVG docs on, I always use like MDN, Mozilla Developer Network, and just pay attention to those syntax. But the reason why we're using SVG today is because it's so similar to HTML. So I think it's going to be like a hopefully natural flow from what you might be already doing in the web to using SVG with D3. And so the pro to SVG, like I mentioned, is that it's easier to get started and interact with because each shape is a element. You can bind, you know, event listeners onto that. Laptops or computers have gotten a slight bit better, but I think it's still a good rule of thumb, which is that with SVG, I've had trouble rendering maybe 2,000 or 3,000 SVG elements in the browser. So anything above that, I wouldn't use SVG for. And anytime I'm trying to animate more than 1,000 elements, I definitely would not be using SVG. And those seem like really big numbers for the DOM. But when you have, you know, data sets with like thousands of rows or tens of thousands of rows or millions of rows, like that's actually not that big of a number, right, for data visualization. So that's one thing to look out for. And the reason why it's not performant at those large scales is because, as you can probably imagine, if the DOM has to, you know, keep track of thousands of these elements and be updating, like be able to like update them at the individual level and potentially have to like, you know, animate them by like updating the attributes or styles on them really quickly, you can probably imagine how computational one canvas element in the DOM, and we draw shapes with a JavaScript API. So we'll have kind of these like these lines that will say, you know, canvas draw rectangle, or canvas arc, or something like that. And what that does is it will draw let's say a rectangle to the canvas, and underneath the hood it's storing that as kind of rows of pixel information. So one thousands or hundreds of thousands of data points with Canvas, because at the end of the day, it's stored as kind of those rows of pixel data. But again, not at all advisable to be rendering tens of thousands of data points, because even if it's technically capable, our human brains are going to have a really hard time comprehending it. So we're not going to touch up on this in this workshop, but there is a very, very important part of data. I almost think it's even more important, the design side of data visualization, than the technical side of data visualization. But today in this workshop, we'll only be covering kind of the coding side. But there is, I think, even all of that, there's a different workshop for that I'll kind of touch on at the end of this workshop. And then the con for HTML5 Canvas is that it really is Canvas. But I still wanted to cover these two. Oh, and the way that I always like to think about it, if you use kind of Adobe products, is SVG is like Illustrator, because all of the shapes is to here make a small disclaimer that with D3, I think people oftentimes think that D3 is only for SVG, and I want to give a disclaimer that D3 is actually HTML. It actually also has Canvas support. So I want to say it's pretty web tech agnostic. Yeah.
There's a couple of questions from
question. Yes, most definitely. We won't cover that in this workshop, but what you can do is oftentimes if you export it, there's the .svg file, and then you can either, just copy and paste that, either copy and paste that SVG string over and then use D3 to select it. And we'll talk about D3 selections later. That's one sorry, you can definitely do it in Illustrator, and usually it will export, usually it will export as SVG paths, and then there's like a string that you can take to then use it in the browser.